Okay, so here we are at the front suspension. We're going to install the front shock first. Now, in the interest of time, and nobody likes to watch boring stuff on YouTube, I have already removed the nuts, loosened mounting hardware. I'll remove the stock shock. Now, a couple things you're going to need is, like I said, I mentioned you need a 17 millimeter box end, open end wrench and socket, 14 millimeter box end, open end and socket, 15/16 box end, open end to fit your jam nuts, or 22 millimeter socket, but once the shock's on and everything, a socket's not going to really fit. So you're going to need those tools in open end. And also a crescent wrench, and I will show you why for that in a second in case we need to get to that point. The other thing is you're going to need a floor jack to support the wheel assembly. You don't want the whole thing falling back and pulling the axle out. There will be no need to remove the tie rod end, although I recommend after the shock package is installed and you've driven it a little bit and got everything settled out, that you might want to run strings and just double check the front end alignment to make sure that the change in geometry and the way it sits hasn't done anything to change your front end alignment. But like I said, again, you want to do all this in a safe manner. You want to use a floor jack to jack up the front and obviously remove the wheel. Use jack stand so we have the machine well supported and we don't have to worry about it falling on us and hurting anyone. And so we're getting ready to do this. We'll take it apart. I'll put the new shock on, show you how to do it. One thing I want to show is people are asking that, do these shocks increase travel or give you more movement in the suspension? Probably kind of hard to see on this video, but the axle right at the moment is just about touching the frame. That's as far as the suspension can go down. I can't increase that with the shock because obviously your axle is the restriction. Also, in compression, there's only so much I can do in compression because you can see I have skid marks on the fender even with the new shocks, and I run 29-inch tires, that's possible for that suspension to compress up so far and your tire rub the body. Now with the 27-inch stock tires and the size of the shock and the way they've been developed, they should go into full compression and into the rubber bump stop before your tire hits your vehicle wall, your firewall, your inner fender. I mean, there's always certain deflection in any metal part or anything, so you may still have some contact with that or with the outer fender. One other thing I found running the bigger tires is I've also taken my outer plastic fender, and what I've done is I've drawn a straight line through the body and I've run that out and I've ground this part of the fender off to eliminate tire scrub. And if anybody's driven a Reaper and really bottomed it out, you know that your tire has come up and also rubbed your outer fender. So by creating that line, making it all the same, because the inner fender actually sticks in further than the body line. So a lot of the tire scrub can be, when it goes up, is that the tire is actually hitting the outer fender and not necessarily the inner wall. So if you cut them the same, it eliminates that problem also. One other thing you'll find is that with these shocks, because the way they do compress a little bit further than the stock shocks, is that running the stock bumper and with 29-inch tires, I found that in full compression and in a turn with the tire turned in towards the bumper, that it is possible for this bumper to bottom out in such a way that it as well will rub on your 29-inch tires or 30-inch, whatever you might be running. It will not do it on the stock 27-inch tires. So what I have done on mine, since I do run 29-inch tires, is that I have cut 2 inches off the end of my bumper tube to stop that tire rub. It's really close. It's only going to happen in certain conditions, in full compression with a wheel turn. Everything has to be just right, but that possibility is there. And I have a really nice set of tires and I really prefer not to chew them up with my bumper ends, so my solution was to cut that off. But enough about rambling on here. Let's get to putting these shocks in. So like I said, you can see I've loosened these parts and loosened the bolts and have everything set, ready to go. So what you're going to do is after you remove the stock shock, and you can do this before or after the upper control arm, but I'd recommend that you remove the stock shock first because it's going to make it easier to spin the upper control arm off of the stock unit. So all we're going to do now is remove our mounting bolts, and if everything comes out good here, I prefer not to tap your bolts out with a hammer, if at all possible. I would prefer, if I'm going to do it, to use a small center punch to punch in the center. You don't want to have your bolt in there and tap on the end and take a chance that you're going to damage your threads at the end of the bolt. And then when you go to put it on, and you're cross-threading your nut and blah, 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 and you know how that all goes. Okay, so I have my mounting points loose, and all you're going to do is we'll pull that out, and you can see we remove the brake line. Now, in the interest of time, and because this is actually one of the new control arms, you would remove that nut, and this, since it's new control arm, ta-da, slides right off. The stock one is going to be threaded on. What I recommend you do is you're just going to be able to spin that out of the way, and you're going to be able to spin that whole control arm off. And then, so to remove the old control arm, that's what you're going to do. You're just going to take that whole unit and spend 5 minutes, spin it off. And hopefully your threads haven't been damaged here and everything comes off really good. Now, once we have it all off, we can put on the upper control arm first, or what I'm going to do is, just because it makes it a little easier to do, is we will get that shock mounted in there. Again, we have our misalignment spacers, little brass collars, size for the stock bolts. You just put those into place, and you put your lower ones into place. Now it's just a matter of fitting that shock in here. What I do is hold those together, get your bottom one in. Let me back up 1 second. This is what you're going to find that your crescent wrench is for. Because there's a possibility that what you want to do is, before you start assembling this all together, you want to make sure that the control arm fits within the, because from the old one being bolted together, you might find that this has actually been collapsed or it's a little tight. As well as the shock mounts, the other shocks might have been bolted a little tight. So you want to check to make sure that the shock fits in there. I recommend, to adjust this in the best manner, is take a crescent wrench and adjust it just for the thickness of the metal, and it makes a really good tweaking tool. And then you can just bend that, either one of these tabs or possibly your shock tab, if you need to open that space up a little bit. If it's open too far, obviously when you bolt it together, that's going to pull the whole thing together. So let's get back to the shock now. We will get our lower one mounted in there. Now you don't want to put one bolt in or the other at the moment until you get the whole thing lined up in here. Once we get that in, let me get the bolt in my hand and pop my spacers back in here. I will get my top bolt in first, and that way your bottom one will just be hanging within your bottom mount, and you don't have to worry about those misalignment spaces coming out. Now, in the interest of time again, I have this all perfectly aligned, but you may find that you need to jack it up or drop it down a little bit more to get the holes lined up on the shock. There we go. Now, the other thing is that I recommend when you put your bolts in, at least your lower bolt, is put your thread to the back. Just in the interest of dirt or things flying along, when it's mounted this way and your nut's tighted, you have exposed threads, and you're more likely to have something come along and damage that thread. So my reasoning is that we will mount it from the front and let the thread stick out the back, and of course, as you travel along, it gives a little bit more protection. We can loosely put the nuts back on. So that's pretty much all there is to mounting the shock. You'll find that the hardest part, and that's not even that difficult, is going to be the upper control arm. Now again, I've drilled this out, so it's going to be set up in such a way that you're just going to be able to slide this on. So what we're going to do is we slide on our new control arm, and you can see it just slides right around there. We'll have to grab the brake caliper because of the way it's going to roll around, and mount that in there. What we'll do, we'll hold this in place. We'll put our jam nut loosely on there. Slide it all in there. Hopefully everything lines up. Use the bolt that way first to get it lined up. And we can get that through. That's pretty much all there is to it. Now all I'm going to have to do is, obviously, tighten the whole thing up. We'll get that bolt through there. We will get our washer back on our jam nut. Now, before you tighten up your tie rod, your upper tie rod on, what I recommend you do is, as we get this all back together, at least loosely put back together, and everything accounted for. Now I recommend that what you're going to do, just take some of the pressure off your parts, is we're just going to jack this up a little closer to where your center suspension is. At this time we can take our brake line and rubber grommet it and slide that into the holder and bend that tab to hold that. We are all set there. Now all we need to do is take our 15/16 end wrench or box end wrench. The other thing you can do is, as you turn this, since this is a locking nut, you're going to find out that it's going to want to twist your tie rod. This is another reason it's good to use a crescent wrench, is that you can hold that tie rod in place as you tighten that nut, and it won't want to twist the tie rod as you do it. So if you've set this along and not really moved your jam nut, everything should go back together just the way it was. And that's pretty much how you do the front suspension. What we're going to do, here we are at the rear suspension. I already have the stock shock out, jacked up, everything's lined up, ready to go, because it just makes it look a lot better for the video. What I recommend when you get to this point is, while you have the shock out, all your tension off your rear suspension, that you inspect your whole suspension, make sure your bushings and everything in good shape, your axle's in good shape. Check for play in your rear caliper and make sure your caliper slides aren't seized up. Now might also be a good time that you can install 90-degree zerks on the bottom, make access for those a little bit easier. So pretty much that's all there is. You just remove the stock shock, and I did that in the interest of time. And we put the new shock on. Put your misalignment spacers in, top and bottom. Just a matter of jacking it around in here. Remember that the piggyback is going to go towards the inside. And the best is tilt the shock way to the inside. Get your bottom bolt in. Get that into place. And then you should be able to pull that shock right up into the upper position. And the upper bolt. Pretty much all there is to it. Again, the shock will come pre-adjusted. When it comes to you at the most common setting for where I found that they've run, make sure your adjustment knob is in the latest setting. You take it, run a little bit, see how it works. I'll put the nuts back on, tighten everything up, put the wheel back on. That's all there is to installing the rear shock. Very simple to do. You'll find that even with a stock exhaust, to adjust this, what you'll do is you'll just reach up inside there, be careful of hot exhaust, and turn the knob to adjust your adjustment to the desired hard or soft, whatever you want. The knob turns the same direction as the front, even though it's turned in towards the back. The rotation is exactly the same. So if you lose track of which way is hard, which way is soft, you can look at the front shock for reference. But pretty much all there is. You just bolt it in, and if you need to, again, you would jack up from the frame, take all the weight off the suspension, and if you need to make any adjustments, there will be enough clearance within the exhaust, and use your spanner wrench or the oil filter wrench, like I said, and then you can just make the adjustments and tighten up your spring tension a little bit more. If you have a heavy object that you're going to be carrying, or if you just want a little stiffer ride or a little lighter ride. All there is to install the rear, again, just a reminder, put the bolts in going from front to back. Makes it a little bit easier to get to it, and also the threads are to the back, and so if you're throwing any stones or anything off the front tires, they're not going to damage the threads and make it harder if you ever have to take the shocks off and get them off. That's all there is to installing the whole set of Beaver Off-Road Walker Evans Racing coilover shocks, and once you have them on there, I guarantee you're going to enjoy the ride, and you're just going to feel that the performance and suspension travel is going to be so much better. You do have a little bit more travel in the rear with these shocks than you do with stock shocks. They also, down inside the cup, have a rubber bump stop, so when the whole thing compresses, you will find that there is about 2 inches more travel in the rear suspension, because that can be gained in the whole movement of how everything goes. You're not limited by the body. You can't get any more lift or height out of it because, again, you have axle clearance problems with the suspension going down. But you do have more compression than you do with the stock shocks in the rear suspension. So you'll find that when the whole setup is all in there, that as you ride, some of the added travel in the rear will take up some of the added travel that would be desirable in the front. So your rear end will float through bumps a little bit better. Your front's going to be a little bit stiffer because it has more restriction in its movement. But the rear will more than compensate for what we can't get the machine to do in the front suspension. And once you get it tuned right, you're just going to find that the ride's so much better. But that's how you install a set of the Beaver Off-Road shocks. And if anybody purchases a set of these shocks, I will also give them a link to this video on YouTube, and you'll have a video on how to install them instead of reading a piece of paper trying to figure it all out on your own. So, hope you all enjoyed the video. Have a good day, and please stop by BeaverOffRoad.com. Thank you. Now, through the miracles of editing and the interest to save time, because nobody wants to sit there and spend 5 minutes watching me tighten a bunch of bolts, everything's all bolted back together, and we're going to get to the adjustment part of the shocks now. Like I said, your main adjustment is, when you're driving every day, is just this knob. You have 8 clicks one way, 8 clicks the other. What we're going to talk about now is adjusting the preload. Like I said, they're going to come set pretty much preset where really close to where you're going to be. It's going to determine how you want your ride to be and what you're most comfortable with, or whether you want a little more play in your suspension, or you want it to be a little bit tighter. If you're using it for the road or you're using it more off-road, at this point, it's going to be your personal preference of what you feel you want your machine to do. But for the most part, what you want to do is, we still have it jacked up from doing this. You can do this with the tire on, but you do want to jack the machine up and take the weight off the tire and the load off the spring. Now, there's two ways to adjust this. Is a spanner wrench, and currently I am having a supply of these made at a local steel shop, and they're going to pretty much look like this. And what this does is fits in the holes on that adjustment collar and allows you to turn it. The other possibility is, although it does scratch that collar a little bit, is an oil filter wrench. This happens to be an adjustable oil filter wrench that you can adjust like a pair of channel locks. Also, that can be used to grab a hold of that collar and turn it as well. Like I said, you can see on these steel jaws, obviously that's going to put a few marks on that collar, but it is a possibility to adjust and a good tool to keep with you in case you happen to lose your spanner wrench. So as far as adjusting the shocks, it's real easy. You just take the spanner wrench and we will fit that around. That fits into one of the adjustment holes. Let's get it around here. And of course, nothing ever lines up when you're doing it on video. And what does it matter of just turning that collar until you achieve the tension you want on your preload. Or if you need to, you can do it in reverse and hook it on this side and loosen that collar. What you're going to do is, I recommend probably not much more than a 1/4 inch at a time or an 1/8 inch at a time. Now you say 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch, how do I know? And this is how I adjust it by any predetermined length. Basically, you're gonna measure off either whatever you want to. You can go off the top, but you'll see that there's an edge to the shock. You can hook a tape measure right there and run down and see what the space is to the top of your collar. You want to make sure that both your fronts are adjusted exactly the same, because you don't want to have one a little softer or one a little harder, unless you happen to be of larger body size and the little woman's riding with you and she happens to be a little lighter. I suppose you could always put a little turn on the other side to accommodate your weight. But all I do is make that measurement and check and see and make sure both sides are the same. That's your pre-adjustment. Now, if you want it to be a little bit tighter, say for instance, right at the moment, this is measuring 5 3/8. Probably what I'd want to do, because the way the spring tension is and the spring rate is, I would probably take that to 5 1/2. When I make that adjustment, I'm going to do it in the softest position on the knob, and then try to get the best comparable ride without being real firm at first, because then when you tighten your knob or adjust your knob for a higher ride, you want to be able to have it so you have adjustments each way. So I would, like I said, I would go like 1/8 inch on this side each time, and with this in the soft position. You're gonna have a little more body roll, you're gonna feel how it goes, but then you'll be able to take this knob and click it in a few clicks, give it a little ride, try the body roll, see how it does. If you feel like you've gotten all the way to the firmest setting or hardest setting and you still have too much body roll, or you just have more movement in your front end that you want, then you can go back and adjust this down a little tighter, go another 1/8 inch, take that at the softest setting and go and do it. Fine-tuning shocks is going to be a little trial and error and probably take you a little bit more time than it would to install the whole package on your machine. But basically, that's how you end up adjusting them after they're mounted on there. And like I said, this can all be done with the tire on. Just jack it up and take the weight off the spring. Also, when you make adjustments, now this fluid is sitting static inside this shock. So when you put it down, you may not, you can't just grab the bumper and notice a big difference in the adjustment. You actually have to get that shock to cycle a couple times So the valving inside will adjust for your adjustment knob on top and what you've done. So you want that fluid, so you're gonna make an adjustment, you're gonna drive it a little bit, you're gonna come back and make another adjustment. Takes a little time to do that, but once you get them all tuned, they're pretty much gonna stay right where you want them, and then it'll just be a matter of taking it and adjusting the knob. Now you can see one other thing I will include in this is I have a 2-inch body lift on my machine, and this fender, inner fender, the adjustment knob is quite easy to get to. You will find on a stock machine that this knob is going to be up behind the fender. All the machine does, clear the shock. You will have clearance there. It will be close tolerance, but you will have clearance. But it will be a little bit harder to adjust that knob on a stock machine because it is going to be hidden up behind there a little bit. There's 2 ways you can do it. You can either reach up in there and grab it, or you can open the hood and adjust it to the top if you need to do it that way. So there is going to be a slight difference in that, what you're going to see if you have a stock machine versus being mounted on my lifted machine. But pretty much everything else is going to be the same because you're not doing anything to change when you do a lift, change the geometry or anything on the suspension. You're just basically lifting the body and giving a little more clearance. So that is how you adjust.